history of Edwin and Barclay Coppock, a compelling narrative that binds our communities of Columbiana County, Ohio, and Cedar County, Iowa. I would like to thank Marcia Howe, who first helped me on this journey, and the Cedar County Historical Society for inviting me to speak. I am profoundly thankful to Marcia and Jeff Kaufman, who were kind enough to give an in-depth and informative driving tour of the Underground Railroad locations, cemeteries, and Coppock-related homes in Cedar County. I would also like to thank the Damascus, Salem, and Winona, Ohio, and Atchison County, Kansas Historical Society. Without the help of these local historians, I would not be able to share the story of these incredible brothers. Herbert Hoover's words, "Freedom is the open window through which pours the sunlight of the human spirit of human dignity," stands tall in the center of Tipton, Iowa. This belief in the inherent light within every human being unites members of the Religious Society of Friends, or Quakers. Quakers were known as a simple and strict society, believing in pacifism, and largely because Iowa settlers, including Anne Lynch Coppock, the mother of Edwin and Barclay Coppock, came from Salem, Ohio. Anne Lynch married Samuel Coppock in Columbiana County, Ohio in March of 1831. They had 6 children: Levi, Maria, Edwin, Lydia, Barclay, and Joseph. Anne was an extremely intelligent woman and fostered her children's love for education. The family had dreams of moving west to Iowa. However, on November 8, 1841, when Edwin was 6 and Barclay was 2, Samuel died of tuberculosis. For 9 years, Anne's children would live amongst the Quaker community near Salem, Ohio. Edwin would live with his aunt and uncle on their farm in Winona, and under the patronage of a prominent Quaker leader named John Butler. Butler was an influential and charismatic philanthropist. He was known to help the homeless and orphans who became destitute. He built the first Quaker schoolhouse on his property and was active on the Underground Railroad, profoundly influencing Edwin's belief that slavery was a travesty against God. While working on the farm during the spring and summer months, Edwin attended school during the winter. He enjoyed farming and took pride in his work. Meanwhile, his brother Barclay lived and worked on a farm a few miles away. Barclay quickly earned a reputation for being mischievous. Edwin and Barclay were two sides of the same coin. While one was studious, careful, and mild-mannered, the other was boisterous, scrappy, and impulsive. Charles Bonsall of Salem recalled Barclay's excellent marksmanship and ability to shoot a moving squirrel mid-air as it jumped from tree to tree. In 1850, Edwin and Barclay moved to Springdale, Iowa with their mother and siblings. Anne Lynch Coppock married a man named Joseph Raley, and the Coppock boys helped to build a family homestead. Edwin was able to buy a team of oxen and started plowing fields for landowners. The boys decided to change the spelling of their last name to a simpler spelling, dropping the final K, which is why we see variations of it today. In 1853, the family celebrated the wedding of their sister, Maria, to Thomas Elwood Tabor in October, while their oldest brother Levi became the town constable. Young and energetic, the Coppock boys had a wild side. Levi and Edwin were eventually banned from the Quaker congregation for dancing after repeated warnings. Nevertheless, this peaceful time was short-lived. In November 1853, their sister Lydia passed away from tuberculosis. Levi and Maria's deaths would follow in the spring and summer of 1858. While the Coppocks were living in Iowa, a lot was changing in the neighboring territory of Kansas. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1850 allowed Kansas and Missouri to decide whether to be free or slave states. Many free state citizens living in Kansas were terrorized by border ruffians from Missouri. The famed abolitionist John Brown and his family lived in Osawatomie, Kansas. Brown had attacked pro-slavery settlers along the Osawatomie Creek. Incensed by the misdeeds of the border ruffians, the Fugitive Slave Law, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, but most of all, the violence these men had inflicted upon the community, Brown and 7 men, which included 4 of his own sons, dragged the pro-slavery men from their cabins, hacking them to death with broadswords in the middle of the night. In the winter of 1857, John Brown and a small band of followers took up residence in Springdale, Iowa, at a farm owned by local abolitionist William Maxson. While there, they practiced military drills and maneuvers. Edwin and Barclay lived just a few miles from the farm. They watched the men drill in the yard. John Brown would continue to visit Springdale, Iowa, and live with the Quaker community off and on for the next 2 years. On one occasion, Brown helped 11 runaway slaves from Missouri, finding refuge within Springdale. No doubt, this event tremendously influenced Edwin and Barclay. In the spring of 1858, Edwin traveled to Atchison County, Kansas, and bought land in a town called Pardee. Pardee had been founded by an abolitionist minister named Pardee Butler, who previously lived in Cedar County, Iowa. Once, while standing on a soapbox in downtown Atchison, Pardee was attacked by pro-slavery slavers, tarred and feathered. He was set adrift on the Missouri River with a flag declaring him an abolitionist. Miraculously, Butler survived and continued to preach and work on the Underground Railroad. Edwin spent the years of 1858 and 1859 traveling between Kansas, Iowa, and Ohio, working on the farms of his relatives and friends. In July of 1859, John Brown sent word to Edwin and Barclay to join him and the raiders. Brown had dreamed of inciting a slave revolt for over 20 years. His target was a federal arsenal in Harpers Ferry, Virginia, now present-day West Virginia. The United States Armory located there had over 20,000 pieces of weaponry. Brown loved the irony of taking control of a federal arsenal located in the South and using the weapons to overthrow slavery. He was utterly convinced that once news of the liberation reached the surrounding plantations, the slaves would rise up and join him. So convinced that Brown had commissioned a blacksmith to make around 1,000 pikes, something like a spear, that the slaves could easily use to fight. He would then lead them into the Appalachian Mountains, creating a free state colony. It is said that Barclay was adamant about traveling to join the raiders. However, he was suffering from an infection that was most likely tuberculosis. Edwin decided that if Barclay was going, he would go as well. When the boys told their mother about their plan, they told a white lie, saying they were going to visit relatives in Salem, Ohio. "We're going to start for Ohio today," Barclay said. "Ohio," his mother replied. "I believe you're going to Old Brown. When you get the halters around your necks, will you think of me?" By August, the Coppock boys were living at a farm in Maryland known as the Kennedy Farm. The raiders lived here in secret while awaiting the raid on Harpers Ferry. There were 22 men in John Brown's band, including himself. 5 men were black with 3 being fugitive slaves. 6 of the men were sons or relatives of John Brown. Many of the raiders were well educated, a couple from wealthy families in the East. Brown decided the revolution would begin on Sunday, October 16th. For a religious man, choosing the Sabbath day was a symbolic gesture. It was decided that Edwin and Albert Hazlitt were assigned to seize and hold the armory across from the engine house. Barclay Coppock, Owen Brown, and Francis J. Merriam were chosen to stay behind to guard weapons at the Kennedy Farm. At 8 p.m., the men lined up in pairs behind Brown's wagon, which was loaded with weapons and supplies. They marched solemnly towards the bridge to Harpers Ferry. Edwin and Hazlitt were able to easily take the unguarded armory. A group of 6 men were sent into the hillside to visit plantations, take slaves hostage, and bring all the slaves and their masters to the arsenal. After 2 plantations were raided, John Brown announced to the former slaves that they were now in command of their masters. He gave each one a pike and instructions to keep the white men inside. However, the slaves were scared and confused, with many thinking they had been captured to sell further south. The great slave revolt that Brown had envisioned never came to fruition. Hour after hour, Brown ignored repeated pleas for men to leave immediately or they would miss their chance. As the night wore on, plans started to go awry. For example, a night watchman came to the Potomac Bridge and realized something was wrong. He ran to a nearby saloon and warned citizens about the trouble at the arsenal. Telegraph wires were not cut. A Baltimore and Ohio train was able to get word to Washington, D.C., It was during this time that baggage handler named Hayward Shepherd was shot by Oliver Brown after not heeding a warning to halt. Tragically, Shepherd, a black man, was the first casualty at Harper's Ferry. Many citizens decided to take matters into their own hands. Drunken mobs surrounded the arsenal and fired on the raiders. Under heavy fire, Edwin managed to escape the armory building and join the others in the engine house. At around 3 p.m. on the 17th, the mayor of Harper's Ferry, Fontaine Beckham, arrived on the scene. Beckham had a reputation for being a kind and benevolent friend to both whites and blacks, but ironically owned 5 slaves himself. He had spent the morning helping his mortally wounded friend, Shepherd Hayward, at the ticket office, but went out several times onto the railroad tracks to get a better view of the battle. Edwin watched as Fontaine Beckham climbed a water tower. Afraid he was a sharpshooter, Edwin took aim and missed. A second shot tore through Beckham's chest, killing him. Unbeknownst to Edwin, Beckham's will freed his slaves upon his death. With this one shot, Edwin Coppock became the only raider to successfully free slaves in Virginia. The militia from Charlestown, Virginia arrived and surrounded the engine house. While carrying a flag of surrender, Watson Brown, John Brown's son, was shot by a citizen. Watson was able to make it back inside the engine house, but the bullet was lodged in his stomach. It would take him 12 hours to die an excruciating death. While suffering from his wounds, he begged his friends to kill him because the pain was too much. He laid his head on Edwin's lap and cried out for a bed. Edwin took off his coat and placed it behind Edwin's head to make him more comfortable. Watson died in Edwin's arms. On October 18th, Colonel Robert E. Lee arrived from Washington, D.C. with Marines. He attempted to convince Brown to surrender, but terms could not be agreed upon. While watching through the firehouse window, Edwin took sight of Lee. He aimed to shoot. A prisoner inside informed Edwin who the colonel was, telling him that shooting Lee would be a death sentence for everyone inside. Coppock lowered his weapon. Lee would later go on to serve as the general of the Confederate Army during the Civil War. The Marines made their way inside after a quick and sudden attack, killing some of the raiders. The prisoners and slaves were released unharmed. Brown and the 4 men remaining were arrested and taken to jail in Charlestown, Virginia. According to Edwin's brother Joseph, while Edwin was on the train to Charlestown, the governor of Virginia, Henry Wise, approached him and said, "You look like too honest a man to be found with a band of robbers." "But Governor," Edwin replied, "we look upon you as the robber." In the end, 10 raiders, 2 U.S. Marines, and 4 civilians were killed. 7 of the raiders would initially escape, but 2 would later be captured and hanged for their participation. Meanwhile, the men left to guard the Kennedy farm had heard gunshots in the distance throughout the weekend. Weapons, they were hiding, and make their way across the mountains to escape. There, they ran into O.P. Anderson and John E. Cook. For 8 days, the men traveled through the mountains of Pennsylvania. Brown had to carry Miriam on his back many times. At one point, John Cook left to find food. The men waited for him, but Cook never returned. He had been captured and sent to Virginia, becoming Edwin's cellmate. As the men reached Chambersburg, they decided to send Miriam to Philadelphia on the train. The decision was risky but successful. The others traveled on by foot to northwestern Pennsylvania and found refuge at a farmhouse. While gathered around a large fireplace, Owen Brown read the newspaper. The men finally learned about the events at Harper's Ferry and Cook's capture. When Barclay learned about Edwin's fate, he listened in silence, but tears slowly ran down his cheeks. It would take the men another 28 days to make it home safely. Barclay arrived in Salem, Ohio, and was taken in by friends. At the same time, Governor Wise put a $1,000 bounty on all the raiders, dead or alive. When the Columbiana County Sheriff found out about the reward for Barclay's capture, the citizens of Salem rallied behind their fighting Quaker. If someone wanted to come get Barclay, they would have to get through them first. Over the next 2 months, John Brown and the captured raiders were put on trial for murder and treason against the state of Virginia. Edwin admitted that he had come to the state to free slaves, but anyone killed at Harper's Ferry had been killed in a fair fight. From Edwin's perspective, they did what they had to do to defend themselves from the drunken mob of vigilante citizens. After a farce of a trial, Edwin was sentenced to hang on December 16th. Edwin's family and friends from Ohio and Iowa started a campaign to have his sentence commuted to life in prison. Two of the people leading the petition were his former guardian, John Butler from Salem, and the postmaster from Springdale, Tom Swinn. The men presented many persuasive papers, letters, and appeals to Governor Wise. Over time, Wise became sympathetic and presented Edwin's case to the Virginia legislature. Nevertheless, the body of men were adamant that no man from the North would escape treason against Virginia. Edwin's fate was sealed. Surprisingly, Edwin was plotting his own escape. While in jail with John Cook, the men used two knives and a long, heavy screw to loosen bricks behind their beds and create a hole to the outside. A friend, Charles Lenhart, had arrived at Harper's Ferry too late to participate in the attack and had become a sentinel at the jail. While on duty on the night of December 14th, Lenhart planned to help the men to freedom. When the time came to make their planned escape, Cook backed out. The decision was made to wait until the next night. This time, Lenhart was not on duty. When Edwin and Cook attempted to make their way over the prison wall, a guard saw them and sounded the alarm. The men were captured and taken back to jail. In his last letter to his Uncle Joshua and Aunt Jane, Edwin said, "I write for the first and last time to thee and thy family. I had hoped to see the dark stain of slavery blotted from our land, when we can say in truth that our beloved country is the land of the free and the home of the brave. But this cannot be. I have heard my sentence passed. My doom is sealed. By taking my life, Virginia is but hastening on that glorious day when the slave shall rejoice in his freedom." On the morning of Friday, December 16th, Edwin and Cook were awoken early. When a Quaker friend told Edwin that it was hard to die, Edwin replied, "It is the parting of friends, not the dread of death that moves us." The men were seated on their coffins and taken by wagon to the gallows. After ascending the stairs, a black cap was placed over their heads. Edwin turned his body towards Cook and reached out his hand. Cook said, "Just a minute, where is Edwin's hand?" As they shook, Cook said, "God bless you." They turned forward, and the noose was placed around their necks. Cook said, "Be quick as possible." Simultaneously, Edwin repeated the words. The floor dropped beneath them, and death came quickly as requested. When Joshua Coppock brought Edwin's body home to Winona, Ohio, a funeral was held for him on his uncle's farm. Somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 people converged on the crossroads to pay their respects to their freedom fighter. He was buried at the Small Friends Cemetery. Rachel Winnery, a neighbor, gave a moving eulogy, saying, "Friends, a brother lies before us, murdered by brother's hands. He was murdered for a principle, and that principle was freedom." Guards were posted at the burial site for 2 weeks out of fear that grave robbers would desecrate Edwin's body. Over time, the citizens of Salem decided it was an insult to keep Edwin buried in a wooden coffin from the state that had falsely accused him of treason. They decided to exhume his body, place him in an Ohio metal-made casket, and rebury him 8 feet deep with boulders covering his coffin at Hope Cemetery. A pamphlet was created inviting all of the prominent families to attend a second funeral on December 30th. This time, over 5,000 people attended the funeral. Barclay returned to Springdale the day after Edwin was hanged. Ann Lynch wrote to a Salem, Ohio friend that Barclay is at home and seems determined to stay, although there are reports almost continuously of someone being in search of him. He says he has hurt nobody and will not run nor will not be taken. I think these friends will take care of him, as they are both numerous and resolute. He stayed a short time with his family, but decided to go for Canada. The election of Abraham Lincoln and the start of the Civil War changed things for Barclay. Although the bounty still stood for Virginia, the urgency to hunt him down was no longer a priority. On July 24, 1861, Barclay was made a first lieutenant in Company C, 3rd Regiment of the Kansas Volunteers. When word spread that Barclay was leading a regiment, many Ohio and Iowa boys joined him. They remembered how bravely Edwin had faced the enemy, and now it was their turn to remember the cause. Before his execution, Edwin wrote to his Uncle Joshua, "The time may come when Barclay will remember me, and the time may come when he will still further remember the cause in which I die. Thank God, the principles of the cause in which we were engaged will not die with me and my brave comrades. Charles Bonsall, the man who remembered Barclay's excellent marksmanship as a child, was one of the Salem boys who joined to follow Barclay into battle. Barclay's regiment was taking a train to Missouri when the bridge over the Platte River was sabotaged by Confederate bushwhackers. On the moonless night of September 3, 1861, the train carrying around 100 men, women, and children began to cross the bridge. Suddenly, the train engine and 3 cars plunged 40 feet into the river. Around 25 passengers were killed. Barclay survived the initial tragedy, but died a day later from a head wound. On April 10, 1865, news reached Salem, Ohio that the Civil War was finally over. Businesses and schools in the town shut down, and people took to the streets to celebrate. Some young men knew that Edwin's original wooden coffin had been stored in the attic of a local business. They decided to retrieve the coffin and parade it down the street. A picture of Robert E. Lee was placed on top, and the boys carried the coffin at the head of the procession, singing the Battle Hymn of the Republic. The relic that once held the body of a persecuted man who sparked the embers and ignited a civil war was finally venerated. John Brown had said, "I am now quite certain that the crimes of the guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." It would take the end of a brutal civil war and the loss of an entire generation of young men to mark the end of slavery. Edwin and Barclay courageously fought to free every person from bondage, sacrificing their lives for the cause of freedom. Let us always cherish the ideal these 2 fighting Quakers envisioned, a nation where the inherent light within every human soul is respected and celebrated with dignity. Thank you.